All right, so in this video, let's talk about useReducer hook in React. And as you can see in their documentation, it says it's an alternative to useState. So hopefully you already know about useState. If you don't, I would recommend you watch that video first and then get to useReducer next. Otherwise, let's just open this basic example I've got right here. So it's a very simplified React project here. I just have my index file here that simply just imports this app component right here. We call that component, and that's this. And in our app component that we export, we create a state, and initially it's 1. That's going to give us this useState, this setState function, which we can use to basically modify that state. Now here, we basically just output that number, that state, and initially it's 1, as you can see. And as we click on this button, we do this handle click, which calls this function, and it takes the old state and we add 1 to it. So basically with all of this, we can just go back here and open this, and if I click, it will just up the number by 1, and because we use useState, it will re-render the component and we'll see the update. So very basic setup here. So now let's try to use useReducer and see what exactly is the difference. So I'm going to go here and also include useReducer in addition to useState. And similar to useState, we'll need to call that, and it's going to give us 2 outputs again, similar to this useState. So we're going to get the first one being the state. Now, because I already have a variable here, state, I'm just going to call it state1. Then we have a function after this that we can call, and I'm going to call it again setState1, like this. And we're going to make it equal to useReducer. Now, unlike this useState, useReducer doesn't just have one argument, which is the initial value. Instead, what it has is 2 arguments. The first argument is a function, and that's the function that's going to be used to modify the state. And then we get the second argument, which is the initial value, which is this, basically. So let's just create a function here. So I'll just use this function. Usually you would create this function separately outside of this, but right now I'm just going to do that directly here. So this is our first argument, being this function right there. And that function here is going to accept 2 arguments. The first argument is going to be your old state, basically. And the second argument, I'm just going to call it arg for argument. The way this is going to work, when you get this setState1 function, this function that we get from this useReducer, we can pass an argument to that function, and that argument is going to be this arg right here for this internal function. So let's see exactly how that's going to work. For now, let's just go here and do return. And we'll take that old state and do +1. Pretty much exactly what I've got here, only here I did it on a single line. I could have done here on a single line too, but I prefer this separation. If you want this to look the same, just so that it kind of looks similar as you look at these 2 pieces of code, so you can kind of draw the similarities here. We can do return, and that will be this. So now let's try to use all this stuff. So I'm going to go here, and right below this, let's just create a horizontal line here. And then below, again, I'm going to do another h1. This time, we're going to output that state1, which is that variable for the state we got from useReducer instead of useState. And then below this, do a button again. And I'm going to call this run reducer. I guess. It doesn't matter. It's the same click me. And we're going to do a function on click. And we're going to say handle reducer click. And then we need to create this function. So I'm going to go here and do function handle reducer click. Let me just zoom out a little bit so you can see this whole thing. And then here we're going to say what's going to happen when we run this function. And in this function, I want to change this state right here. And we're going to use that setState1 function to do so. Like this. And here in parentheses, we're going to pass an argument. For now, I'm going to call it null. Now that null is going to be this arg. Whatever we pass here, it's going to go here inside of this function that we declared inside of this reducer. Now, I get some errors here. I think I've made a mistake here. Instead of doing const accurately, I did inaccurately const. So let's hit save. Let's just go back and take a look and see what this looks like. So if I save this, we go back and take a look. See, we got two click me's. I click on the first one, it goes up. I click on the second one, it goes up. So basically now I've created the same thing using useReducer instead of using useState. So the whole shtick with this function is that this allows us to now pass this argument, and then we can use that argument to do something with that. So for example, I can pass 3 here, and then we can use that argument here and say, let's take the old state plus that argument that we pass here, that 3. So now if I save this and we go back and take a look, I'm gonna refresh this, I click this, it goes up by 1, as you would expect if I click on this. If I click this, it goes up by 3 because now we use that argument that we pass, and we use that argument to actually modify the state. As far as how you use that argument, it's completely up to you. There are some conventions that you're going to see, but in the end of the day, you could do it any way you like. Most of the time, when you pass these arguments, you don't pass a single value like this. You pass more like an object. And the reason for that is because most of the time when you use this useReducer, you may have multiple different things you want done with your state, depending on some changes. So maybe you want, in some cases, to add the number, increment it. In other cases, you want to decrement it. In some other cases, you may want to decrement by 7. So in different cases, you may want to do different things. And for that reason, most of the time here, instead of just passing one single value as this argument right here, you pass some sort of object with multiple things in it so you can actually use it. So a common thing you're going to hear is having this actions and this dispatch and all of this stuff. That's the terminology you're going to hear. And usually the way that works, instead of this here, you call this dispatch. That's the convention. And then you call that function dispatch here. Again, that's usually the convention, to call this dispatch. And then this second function here that we did here, this first argument that we passed, which is the actual function we use to change the state, that's what we call a reducer. Now, I did this function right here directly, but what we could do, we could usually go on top here and create a function, and I'm going to call it reducer. And basically, that's going to be this function right here. So I'm going to copy that and paste it here. So that will be this reducer function. And then we can just grab this and replace it with that reducer. So this is the way you're going to usually see it in code. When you look at it, it's going to say like reducer, that's your reducer function, this, and then you have dispatch, which is this. That's the function that allows you to pass an argument to this reducer function, which is going to become this second argument here. The first argument being your previous state. And the other thing here is that usually you will not see this called old state like this. You will probably just see this saying state and state like so. But again, it doesn't really matter. Just because you rename something, it doesn't make it any different, right? So if I save this the way I did now, if I go back and reload, we click here, it goes up by 1, this goes up by 3, just like it did before. So now let's actually get rid of the regular use state. So there's less stuff on the screen. So I'm going to get rid of this part and then this function. And now we basically just use useReducer at this point instead of using useState. Build failed. I don't know how I got that here, but let's just get rid of this. And at this point, this should be just the reducer one that goes up by 3. Let's say we want to use this reducer function and have it do different things depending on different circumstances, right? So what we could do here, instead of this 3, we can just specify some text that we pass to that function. We can say increment. The way this could be used now, I can now go here. This is going to be this argument now, right? I can go inside of this function and say if that arg equals increment, which is this right here. In that case, we can say return state plus that argument. Then we could now use another case. So let's say I also want to create another button here that will decrement that number down instead of going up. So I can copy this button here and on-click, and then we'll call it run minus, and this one run plus. And this function here, handle reducer click, so I'll just call it minus. And this, let's call it plus. Then let's go and change this function to plus. And basically we'll create that second function called minus here. And in this function, instead of increment, we'll pass a different string, like this. And then here, when we get that argument, which is going to be this text, we can check, okay, we already checked in case of increment what's going to happen. We can do another one and say, okay, so if that ends up being this instead, let's do that minus. Let's actually do 1 here instead of that argument because we cannot add the text. And we'll talk about that 1. We'll come back to that in a second, and we'll actually update that to be a different number. But for now, let's just do +1 minus 1. So again, at this point, when we do this dispatch, this text is going to be this argument. Then we're going to check if that argument equals increment, which will be this case. Then let's do this. And if it's decrement, let's do this. And usually it's a good idea to have an option what's going to happen in all the other cases. So otherwise we can say return if it doesn't match increment or decrement and you call it with some other information other than those two, you can say do something else. So you could, for example, just give it an error. Instead of new, let's actually throw an error and say invalid. I guess we're not going to return anything. We'll just throw invalid argument passed to reducer function. So if you call with anything other than this 2, we'll throw this error. All right, so let's save this. Let's go back and take a look. So as you can see, I'm going to refresh this. If I do this plus, it goes up by 1. If I do this minus, it goes down. It can go down more, as you can see. So there we go. Now we use that and it works. So now we have this kind of conditional way of modifying our state based on what we pass here as a value. So now let's get back to that other thing when I used to have like up by 3 or up by a different number here. So how do I do that? Since we only just pass this as a single argument right here on top, then the way we can handle that here, we can pass that argument as an object. So here, instead of just a single value, I can pass an object here, which is still going to be a single value, only as an object. And usually this they call action. You can call this anything you want, right? We can call it type, I guess. Actually, I guess that's what they call usually. I think they use type, but I don't know. I don't really follow the conventional that much, to be honest with you. But anyways, you can use anything you want. So I'm going to do type. There it is. So now this is type. Since this is an object, this argument, then to access that type, we're going to do arg.type to make this still work. And here we're going to do arg.type to, again, make sure that this actually works. And the reason we want to do this is because now, because it's an object, we can pass a second parameter here. So usually, I think they call it like payload or something. It doesn't matter. You can just call it value or whatever you want. So right now, I'm just going to call it value. And let's do 3 here. And then let's do value here. And let's make this one 5. So I'm going to increment by 3, and I'm going to decrement by 5. Now here, this arg is this object, right? So if I wanted to get to this value here, I would do arg.value. And the same thing here, I would do arg.value too. So if I save this now, go back and refresh this. If I click plus, see it goes up by 3. If I do minus, it's going to go up apparently by 5. That's what I set it to. See, this is 5 and this is 3. Now, most of the time, I think they call this payload. And then in that case, this is going to be payload. And then this arg, I think they call it something else. Let's see what they usually call it. Apparently, action is what they call it. See here, action. Yeah, there it is. So they got action type. So they do call it type. So we're going to do action. So let's rename it in the convention they have it. But the reason I wanted to do this way is because when they have this terminologies, sometimes it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So there it is. So now we got action, which is this. We got our state, which is this. And action.type is going to give us this. And payload is going to give us this. Now, as a payload, you could pass another object instead of just being a number if you wanted to. But in the end, it doesn't really make any difference. Now, usually, instead of doing this if statements, you will see some sort of case statement. So you can see if I go back to their example, they have this switch and case, which is basically another way of doing if. So let me actually grab that and let's use this in our example. So I'm going to go back, grab here, and basically I'm just going to keep that on top and we'll just replace it with this in just a second with this switch statement. Now it's grayed out because we already did our returns on top, but it doesn't matter. Now here, see, we're going to check if this action type equals increment. Now for me, I did that uppercase. So that's that case here. Then what do we want to return? And what we want to do is we want to do this. So I'm going to grab that. And I'm going to put it here. So that's that. The same way, the second one is our decrement. So that's going to be this case. If it's this, then we're going to do this. If it's this, then we're going to do this. And finally, we have this default. And see, there's that throw error, which is basically this. And I'm going to go ahead and now get rid of all the stuff I did before. So now we got a switch statement instead of using if statement. So if I save this, go back, and we reload, we should end up with exactly the same thing. This goes up by 3, that goes down by 5, whatever that number is, and that's the number we set right here. And then finally, if you didn't want to do this separate function like plus here and here, you could basically just do this dispatch right here. So we can basically just create an internal function right here and simply just call that first dispatch. And then for the second one, we can do the same thing. And now I can get rid of these two functions. And maybe just to make this nice, instead of state1, let's just call both of these state. Like so. And if I refresh and we go back and reload, it should work exactly the same way. And that's how this whole thing works. So basically, the whole idea here is that this reducer function is the function that's going to modify our state. That's the logic of modifying the state. And whatever this returns, that's what your state is going to become. And again, most of the time, people will probably put this in a separate file. So you can go here on the left and create another file and call it reducer or whatever else you want to call it, .js. And then we can basically just grab that function that we've created right here. I'm going to copy it and paste it here. And then we'll just export this function called reducer. That is located in this file called reducer. So I'm going to save that. So now, because I did that, now I can import that from here, right? So instead of having all of that here in this file, we can just say import reducer from this reducer file. And the reason I'm using this syntax is because I did this named export right here. So at this point, because I have this reducer, now I can get rid of this, which will be that same code from the other file. And if we save this, we should be able to go back and see that this still works exactly the way it did. And we can still work with this. And there you have it. That's how useReducer hook works in React. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.